A number of guests duly introduced by fellows beg leave to attend your meeting. Is it your pleasure that I welcome them in your name? Thank you. Minutes.
The minutes of the ordinary meeting of the Society Antiquaries of London held on Thursday, 9th of March 2023 in Burlington House and online. Professor Martin Millett, President, in the chair. The minutes of the ordinary meeting of Thursday, 2nd of March 23 were read and signed. The following being in attendance and having signed the obligation required by the statutes were duly admitted fellow Christopher Claxton Stevens. The following communication was then laid before the Society. Wentworth Woodhouse, new evidence concerning the design and furnishing of the Yorkshire Palace by Peter Brown, MBE, FSA. Thanks for return for this communication. The President announced that the next meeting will be on Thursday, 16th of March 2023, then adjourned the meeting. A reception followed.
Is it your pleasure that I sign these minutes as a true and complete record? Our main business this evening is to hear a lecture from Dr. Simon Timberlake. Simon has had a career as a geologist and a museum curator, moving into field archaeology in 2006, working for the Cambridge Archaeological Unit. And from 2017, he's been a freelance archaeometallurgist specialist till his retirement last year. Director of the Early Mines Research Group, been deeply involved in archaeological projects in Wales and England over more than 30 years, dealing with a wide range of sites, including Alderley Edge and Cwmrystwyth in mid-Wales. His research has ranged not only across England and Wales, but has included collaborations with museums in Germany and Georgia and Austria. A common theme of his research, particularly in Wales, has been identifying the paleo-environmental record of metal mining preserved within peat bog archives. He's going to talk to us this evening about drawing lots of this work together with a paper, Before the Great Orme, the Discovery and Exploitation of Metal Ores in Early Bronze Age Britain. Welcome, Simon.
Shall I just press F5 to get up on the screen? Good afternoon, everybody. Well, it's been a long, eventful, and very interesting journey of 30 years, as the chair said, of our group investigating the origins of mining in the Bronze Age in Britain. We have worked all over the world, as the introduction said, but I think the point I want to make is that I'm representing our group here, and that I'm indebted. And it's basically a combined effort. So it's the whole team who are really presenting this lecture today. So I would like to start really by sort of making it clear that I think what we're looking at, we tend to look at these mines, these early Bronze Age mines, these Bronze Age mines located around Britain. But it's important to realize that we have almost a millennia of exploration going on before in terms of stone axe factories and resource extraction throughout the Neolithic and even earlier. And when we've started to excavate a number of these sites, we've realized straight away that there is some evidence beneath all the Bronze Age exploitation of activity. What this activity is, it's very difficult to say because it's very, very ephemeral and the signal is quite weak, but there's nevertheless beneath these early metal period extraction sites, we see evidence of still earlier work. And I think I think the point here is that, as I said in my 2009 paper, that there's in the technological revolution underlying this change from stone to metal, the necessary precursor for this development of indigenous metallurgy was this mental geological map of the British Isles. And this was an ingrained thing over hundreds of years, and this knowledge was there. And so these sites were probably known about, these very obvious mineral outcrops. And there would have been, I said, this map, which would have been referred to about where to go and where to find and where to look stuff. As I said, a number of these sites, particularly at Copperhill, Cwmaswyth, another site in the Plynlimmon area at Nantyricet, at Alderley Edge in Cheshire, and also in the Forest of Dean, we found evidence of very, very slim evidence that there has been some search and extraction of minerals for pigments. And obviously in the Forest of Dean, this will be for iron ochres. But in the areas where we have copper and lead extraction, and particularly Alderley Edge, there's a lot of pigments in the sandstones, and there's evidence that there's quite a lot of Neolithic activity at these sites of the later Bronze Age mines. So nothing is new; it's already known about, and this is why that this phase of early Bronze Age prospection, I think, developed so rapidly. I want to just give an overview, and it's sometimes better to give an overview at the start. So the earliest mining of the Copper Age, early Bronze Age in Ireland between 2400 and 1800 BC has been identified at Ross Island on Loch Killarney. And this was associated with the Beaker period mine that was excavated by Dr. Billy O'Brien at the University of Galway in the turn of in the millennium years. So this is the earliest source in the British Isles of Metal Age exploitation, and this was followed soon after by the extraction from a number of small primitive mines, mostly those within the Old Red Sandstone in County Cork and County Kerry in southwest Ireland. So we can see this map of Britain over in the southwest of Ireland, this group of mines, and then over in the western part of Britain, another group of mines. So prospection and small-scale mining within the uplands of Western Britain for oxidized ores took place in the period 2200 to 1600 BC. Whether these are exactly the same, they're certainly, we don't have copper arsenical ores in these early Bronze Age sites, but they're mostly associated with chalcopyrite, copper iron sulfide ores, and within the oxidized portions of these veins. So these are oxidized copper minerals. And perhaps as little as 50 tons of copper metal was produced from these mines and prospection sites prior to the main Great Orme period of production in the Middle Bronze Age. So we see this map of Britain, and these sites represent at least 14 early Bronze Age mines, which have been identified and dated through excavation. And all but the Great Orme, all the rest of the mines, the work's been undertaken by our group over the last 30 years. And this includes 10 mines within the Central Wales ore field. You see the map at the bottom of the screen shows this group of mines associated with the Plynlimmon mining district. And in fact, it represents the largest group of mines and also the earliest ones. And this is a really interesting phenomenon, which we'll talk about shortly. So I'm going to go through just doing a very brief description of some of the other mines, but I'm going to dwell in more detail on the mines of West Wales, which we have spent more time investigating. I worked at Alderley Edge for the Manchester Museum and the National Trust, funded by the Leverhulme grant in 1997, 1998 through to the 2000s. And this was to investigate the archaeological landscape, but particularly the ancient mines, which were known about, had been known about for more than a century. So the mines here, you see Engine Vein here, and you can see in the side of the Engine Vein, indicated by the green arrow, the remains of a pit working which has been dissected by later post-medieval working. And these pit workings have the remains of stone tool marks on them. So the pit workings are in sandstone, and these are Triassic sandstones, and the extraction was for oxidized ores, for malachite and azurite, which was disseminated throughout the porous sandstones and concentrated in certain areas where these pits were dug. Alderley Edge is important because it's the only site in Britain from which we have large numbers of grooved cobblestone hammers. And this is a quite unique phenomenon, which is almost restricted to the mines of Alderley Edge and Mottram St Andrew, which is a neighboring mine. These were uncovered in the 1900s. Roeder and Graves wrote papers on them, but also an oak mining shovel, which was dug up in 1878 by during when William Boyd Dawkins was the curator at Manchester Museum, and was described by Frederick Sainter. This is now in the collections of the Manchester Museum. Here is the wooden shovel. It's remarkably well preserved. It's impregnated with copper and lead minerals. And we did a study of it and using putting this in the Daresbury synchrotron, which is facility which is near Manchester, to look at the whole distribution of metal in the shovel. And you could see the copper in the handle where people have been holding it, and also the copper around the tip of the shovel. So it was a very interesting study. So there's 3 identified Bronze Age mining sites at Alderley Edge, and we excavated at Engine Vein, which is here. So this is one of the pits that were looked at by Roeder and Graves on the south side of Engine Vein. This has been exposed since Roeder and Graves worked there in the last century, in the 19th century. So these were dug as prospection pits. So they were trying to follow the copper impregnation in the sandstone to richer pods, which they could take out. They were following the bedding planes. This is an empty pit working. You can see the imprints of the hammer of these stone tools in the side of this pit. It's preserved because it's a barytized, very, very hard sandstone here, which has been mineralized by barite. And you can see some of the small lenses of malachite, which they extracted on the bedding plane. So this was just prospection pits dug towards these larger pits, actually on the vein itself. We undertook a very interesting excavation. We found a completely virgin pit there. This is this pit EVB1 on the south side of Engine Vein in 1997, which we carried out a very detailed excavation of. And it was quite a complex pit. It had evidence of copper processing, crushing copper ore. It had a hearth in it. It had an area where stone hammers were being flaked to produce blades, a secondary recycled use. And at the base of it, it had these broken pieces of these nice groove stone hammers, which had been carefully placed in the base of the pit, like as a place deposit. So it's a really quite interesting sort of reference, of this careful deposit in the base of the pit. Moving further east now, on the edge of the White Peak, this is the Manifold Valley, Ecton, in Staffordshire, on the Staffordshire White Peak. And these were the Duke of Devonshire's mines at Ecton in the Manifold Valley. And in the 18th and 19th century, They recorded finding ancient workings, stone tools, antler tools, and bone tools as well in the workings. And so we came here as part of a project with the Peak District National Park, and headed by John Barnett, then the archaeologist for the park. And we surveyed and excavated at Stone Quarry Mine and another mine, which is at the Lum, which is just to the east of here. This is the Lum Bronze Age mine, which we excavated in 2009, which proved to be really quite productive and you know, very positive in terms of results for the whole excavation program. This is written up in the Proceedings of the Prehistoric Society as a paper by myself and my colleagues. So excavation 2009 revealed these shallow galleries driven into malachite-coated dolomitic limestone. So the bedded limestone here is interbedded dolomites and limestones, and they've gone along the bedding planes, extracting them from the roof, or blocks from the roof, and going into these small galleries. Associated with them are stone tools. We found an antler point, which was the tip of probably interchangeable tip used in an antler pick, because the antler picks wear down so quickly. This one had probably been placed inside a hole in the pick as a replacement. Seems likely. Bone picks, quite a lot of other bone tools, discoid hammers, hammer stones, crushing tools. Also, a couple of thumbnail scrapers, which is a good indication of this sort of early Bronze Age, possibly even, you know, well, it was certainly early Bronze Age cultural association of this site. And the radiocarbon dates again put it in between, between 1900 and 1680 Cal BC. So this is the second only confirmed Bronze Age mine in England. Paris Mountain, or Mynydd Paris in Welsh, is on the northeast coast of Anglesey. This was the largest in historic times. This was the largest copper mine in Europe for a few years at the end of the 18th century. It's a fantastic site. This is a view, a panoramic view of it today. It's a must, really, if ever you get a chance. If you don't know the site, if you're in Anglesey on holiday, or whatever, do visit it. It's incredible, and there's signage and walks and everything there now. Anyway, from our interest, ancient fire set workings were found at the top of the mountain in 1796 and recorded by Sir Christopher Sykes. So the EMRG, our group, excavated a site near the Summit Windmill, which you just see in the background there, in 1988, and we got our first radiocarbon dates from prehistoric mine spoil within the Oxon Quarry on the surface, buried beneath peat. Since then, David Jenkins discovered underground Bronze Age mining remains at depths of between 10 and 20 meters. And most of the program of investigation has been with David, with some of the help of myself and my colleagues. This is an example of one of the stone tools that were found scattered on the surface. They're difficult to find nowadays, but they were much more common. But underground is a different matter. You can see this is from the picture at the top. It's a picture of prehistoric mine spoil, which one of the 19th century rises in the 19th century workings has broken into the top. And out of this are coming a lot of stone tools, a lot of preserved organic material, very good for dating, lots of, and very good environmental evidence as well. On below, this is a diagram where I've provided showing a model of how I think the mines were worked in the early second millennium BC. You can see all the sort of the 19th century mine, the 19th century workings underneath, the 18th century mine spoil. The 18th, 19th century mine spoil largely cover the entrances to these prehistoric mines at surface. That's why we can only gain access to them from underground. And they appear to be through inclined drifts or open casts. So these are open workings, but they're driven down. So driven down into the ore bodies. And this is a massive sulfide ore body with some enrichments in the chalcopyrite veins. And, you know, it's our belief that almost certainly they're working. I've shown the pre-mining water table here. And the top of this massive sulfide deposit has been heavily oxidized. You've got a gossan at the surface, which is an iron hydroxide layer, which was removed when the modern mine happened. But beneath that, you have these supergene minerals, enriched secondary minerals, and this includes native copper, copper oxides, copper sulfides, supergene copper sulfides. But we don't have any carbonates here because it's very low, very acidic environment. It's interesting that Lenton in 1800, as German mineralogists, found masses of native copper weighing as much as 15 kilograms. So when the modern miners broke in, where the prehistoric miners hadn't worked, they found this highly enriched ore, which included native copper. So it does occur to me that maybe the prehistoric miners were taking out this super rich copper ore, which is effectively native copper and copper oxides. As the name of this talk suggests, I'm not talking about the big story of the Great Orme, because that's the subject of Alan Williams' Boom and Bust, his book he's just published in Archaeopress, and his antiquity paper, which some of you might have read. Extremely valuable and useful piece of work, very, very good. But the reason I'm talking about this is the Great Orme has its origin in the early Bronze Age, and the earliest radiocarbon dates from the Puchlai open cast, which we see here, are probably from around 1800, 1740 Cal BC. But the mine, of course, goes into the late Bronze Age. Most of it, of course, underground workings happening in the Middle Bronze Age. So here we have, this is the Carboniferous limestone, dolomitized Carboniferous limestone, chalcopyrite ores in these veins that cut the dolomitized limestone, being oxidized to malachite and iron, and oxidized or iron oxides, which also include copper in them. So the high pH alkaline conditions means low mobility of copper, and therefore rich concentrations of ore within these oxidized portions of the veins close to surface. Here, if you visit this is now a tourist mine, you can see many of the ledges which have got stone tools and bone tools on the surface, and this is as they excavated the mine in the 90s, archaeologically excavated, they found these remains. So we know the site well, but we know this is not our work. This is the work of the Great Orme Exploration Society and the Great Orme Mines. So Copper Hill, the Comet Lode open cast in Copper Hill, which is perhaps the type site for these early Bronze Age mines, which I'm going to talk about in more detail. I'm just going to introduce here. So here we are looking at the open cast on the top of Copper Hill. We're looking at up to 5,000 tons of rock waste removed between 2100 and 1650 BC, which are below, these tips have been cast down the slope below it and were since covered with turf and peat, which is now eroded away. So it's re-exposed. It looks very much like some of the Neolithic axe factory sites where you get quite a lot of erosion. So this was a medium-large size early Bronze Age mine, probably producing 5 or more tons of copper metal. So that doesn't sound a lot, but of course 5 tons of copper metal in the earliest Bronze Age period, from the 3rd millennium to the middle of the 2nd millennium, is still quite a significant amount of metal. So this is a single 45-meter long by 20 to 8 meter wide and more than 10 meter deep infilled mine trench, which has been archaeologically excavated now. So I'm just going to show you, I think it's a good point really to look at some of the dating of these sites, and to start off by looking at the model radiocarbon dates. Peter Marshall of English Historic England has undertaken this modeling. We now have more than 100 dates from these Bronze Age mines. here we have both, this includes all the dates, so it includes the dates from the Middle Bronze Age workings at the Great Orme. So here you can see these start dates and end dates of mining at the various different sites, and you can see the sort of model calibrations here. The two red lines basically indicate a quite clear, distinct range between beginning, early, start and end dates for these early Bronze Age mines. Then, the green line basically is looking at the end of the whole mining period, which is effectively the mining that happened on the Great Orme. So you can see two quite distinct ranges here, but with an overlap. Of course, mining started on the Great Orme in the early Bronze Age, but most of the dates and most of the activity reflect Middle Bronze Age dates. This is perhaps another way to look at these posterior density estimates from the calibrated radiocarbon ages. And this is for individual mines. So we can see, for instance, the earliest date is at Copper Hill, Cwmystwyth. And this has turned out the earliest dates for the whole for mainland Britain. Followed shortly after by the mines on Paris Mountain on Anglesey, Alderley Edge, and the Lum and Stone Quarry mines are at Ecton in Staffordshire. And then we can see, even though there's an overlap with the Great Orme, that effectively goes right into the Middle Bronze Age, up between 1600 and 1400, effectively 1300 BC. And yet another way to look at it. So if we look at the start dates for mining across Britain, we can see that we can see from the probabilities that most mining started during the last quarter of the 3rd millennium BC in mid Wales. This is an 80% probability that this was the case. British mines fall into 3 distinct groups. This is mid Wales, the North Wales group, and Northwest Central England. The model shows a likely order for the start of mining activity in these areas. So it starts in mid Wales, which is interesting, of course, because we almost certainly have a linkage with mining in Ireland. And rather than going to North Wales, the earliest dates seem to be in mid Wales. So it goes mid Wales, North Wales coast, Northwest Central England. That's a 43% probability. So I think that's a pretty good model. Remember, we've got more than 100 radiocarbon dates now. So returning to Copper Hill, to the Comet Lode open cast, we can see this highlighted in the evening sunlight. And you can see the dramatic light, well, straight away you get a feel of this dramatic landscape, this quite isolated landscape, these glacial U-shaped valleys and remote areas on the west side of the Cambrian Mountains. And so what is interesting is that when these mines started to be, mining started again in the 18th century, it didn't take long for astute observers to notice that there was evidence for ancient mining. The earliest evidence was a mine just to the north of here, a place called Tulchamoy near Darran. And Lewis Morris, who was a Crown mineral agent in 1744, his workmen found evidence for fire setting for stone tools in this lead-silver mine, which was also a copper mine, as it happened to be. And he found these stone tools, and he describes them. He said the wedges were sea stones with one end nipped off to an edge, and there is an impression on the other where they were used to strike on. And it's really interesting. That's exactly what we realize now. Most of these cobblestones used as mining tools have in fact been brought to the site from elsewhere. Lewis Morris also astutely noted these ancient mines. They worked before man knew the use of iron, which of course, is effectively saying they're pre-Iron Age, and he recognized they were probably for copper. In 1813, the first record for the discoveries of stone tools at Cwmystwyth was in 1813. In 1846, they were recorded as being on Copper Hill, which is almost certainly in this, on the Comet Lode open cast we see here. In 1937, Oliver Davies came to Cwmystwyth Paris Mountain with the British Association for the Advancement of Science Committee into Ancient Mining in Wales to look at these sites. He concluded without any dating that they were probably Roman or Old Celtic, whatever that means. But we have a debt of gratitude to Oliver Davies for alerting us to the site and doing the first archaeological work in these places. I came here in 1986 and excavated a big trench across the lower tip here on my own and got the first radiocarbon dates for a mid-Wales mine, and only the second evidence was only the second example of Bronze Age mining in Britain, the other one being Great Orme. In 1989, we started a major program excavation forming the Early Mines Research Group, which continued to 2002. So I'm going to look at, show you some of the examples of some of the amazing finds that we found in the Comet Lode open cast, this mine up on Copper Hill. And you can imagine the logistical problems of trying to excavate at 426 meters above sea level without any track and without a proper footpath up there, having to bring scaffolding up there and to locate and to have, live in up there in all shades of weather. Anyway, this was one of the first interesting finds against the footwall of the lode within the open cast. This is mine gallery. You can see the wonderful work in the roof. This is all worked with stone tools, and it's almost like a sculpted roof. They work by fire setting to make this drivage, trying to find another vein that was beyond this. But they've worked and secured the roof by hammering these you can see these arched roofs here, which have been hammered back with stone tools. The picture on the left gives you a very good idea of the height of our excavations when we'd got down to a depth of about 8 meters in the center of the open cast. And it shows you the sort of relief, the negative relief of the working with these benches. And you can see evidence of where people have been climbing down and making steps on the side to go down this into the rocky quarry, if you like, where they've been mining the veins in the middle. Also, this fantastic section here on the left, where there's a radiocarbon dated sections where we've got amazing environmental evidence, but also radiocarbon dates going from the early Bronze Age workings at the bottom, right up through the Middle Bronze Age, Late Bronze Age, Romano, British and medieval infill, which includes scree, washed in sediments and mostly peat. On the right-hand side, we see this rock cut mine entrance where some of the best finds were made. This is the entrance to the open cast. And this rock cut channel was probably cut to drain the workings, but it was also used as a working area. We'll see more of this later. These are some of the finds. You recognize this, I'm sure, as an antler. It's part of an antler mine, a mining pick made of red deer antler. And these mining picks, these deer antler picks, are very different from the sort of antler picks you find, for instance, in chalk landscapes, in sort of, excavating the Great Ditch at Avebury or something like that when they're working chalk, where they're sort of quite pristine with their tines intact. Here they're all working in hard quartz veins rocks. And so the antlers are still very useful, we know this, but they wear down very, very quickly. And so we only found very good examples of these where it was very waterlogged, and when you got geochemical preservation halos in the sediments where they survive. In other places, we found traces of antler. We think probably more than 60 antler tools were probably used from the evidence of the phosphate analysis that we have of the antlers that don't survive. This antler was turned round after the pick had worn down and used as a hammer. Again, some examples of some of this one and another antler pick. On the right-hand side here, on the right-hand side, we see Brenda, my colleague, Brenda Craddock, and she's, this is at our experimental fire setting site at the bottom of the hill. And after fire setting, we're using modern antlers, butchered antlers, as picks, and to show that how these were used against the more sort of split, shaly type rocks, whereas the really hard quartz outcrops, they use these stone tools. During the excavation of the mine, we made this one remarkable find here, and we recognized it almost straight away because we've been doing these experiments of hafting these stone tools, these cobblestone tools. When we found this, we realized that this was very similar to the tools that we had made. The handles are made from twisted hazel, and that when we were using these tools, they always used to break where the twisted withy of hazel had been wrapped around the stone, and they used to break at that point where they became weak on the edge. And lo and behold, when we found this, we knew exactly what it was when Brenda was excavating it, because we have one half here, and just behind her hand, we found the other half. So it actually broken on the spot, and they just thrown the two halves down, and then it got stamped in onto the working floor of the mine. These examples of some of the hammerstones that Brenda reconstructed and we've used in experiments. When we look at the assemblage of the Bronze Age mining tools, we see really quite, although they're all cobblestones, up to 79% of these, we've clearly identified as tools that we brought from the coast, which is 25 kilometers distant from the mine and up 426 meters above sea level. So they were clearly searching. There's a great, they were after very specific pebbles, and when the pebbles they collected from the storm beaches were really, really good because they didn't have flaws in them, and they survived. They were smooth and they were resilient. Basically, they were the best sort of material for using as tools. So here we have a range: stone mining hammers, wedges, and picks. Only 10% of these larger cobbles were actually modified by notching for this hafting. So clearly some of them were used by hand. Many of them were used as hafted tools, but they didn't have to make a complete groove around it like we see at Alderley Edge. Some of the, also the disused hammerstones, once they've been put down again after use, if they're flat, we found they often pick them up and use them as anvil stones. And you can see they've been used as anvil stones because they have impressions where they've been used anvils for crushing ore. The smaller, so we have lots of small stones used as handheld crushing stones on these anvils. We have pecking stones for making the notches on the larger cobbles. And this slab quern, we found one large slab quern which had been used for fine grinding. Looking at some of the other organic finds from the mine, from the same area, from the entrance area, this is remains of hazel creel basket, so like an open type basket, possibly for collecting ore, bringing ore out of the mine. Perhaps they climbed up the steps with a collection of good, partially crushed ore samples. This remains of a basket. It'd clearly broken, it'd been thrown down, and it'd been kicked into the nearest hearth. And you can see it's been burnt, probably a fire setting hearth on the side of the working face of the mine. And then there's some more, this is a rope twisted rope made of hazel. And it's really quite exceptional to find these sorts of locations. These things are often found at coastal locations in the Neolithic and Bronze Age, in the coastal waterlogged deposits. But it's a very unusual environment to find them at the top of a mountain in this sort of unique environment within the waterlogged bottom of this mine. These are all probably used for carrying wood, for carrying basketry, for ropes for pulling bags or baskets out of the mine. Undoubtedly, the best find we ever made. It's not really, sorry, it's concealed by the top of this menu bar here, but this is a hollowed out Alder launder. So this is a 5 meter plus long selected log, straight log, which had been brought up to the mine, and when it was still green, freshly felled, and then cut using flat bronze axes and wooden wedges. And you can see the remains of the working signature marks of the axes in the base of the launder. And when we found it, it was actually in situ in the base of this entrance area. And there was another one here and one behind it. And so it seems to be a series of these wooden launders, presumably used as drains. Once they wanted to work in this area, they were channeling water that was coming into the mine along these launders. But I think there's another really important function of this. And here's a reconstruction of it. And I think they were both for managing water, like for draining it, but also for using the water. In this case, the water seems to have been tapped and things flowing into the open cast and then directed out along this channel, as I pointed out. But it was almost certainly, in my opinion, was used again for both washing and for separating the crushed ore. So there's two things. When you're separating the crushed ore, you're trying to separate the minerals from the rock particles by gravity separation in the water flow, by controlling the water flow. You're trying to separate out the lead minerals, the heavier lead minerals from the copper minerals. Then I think they might be trying to do something else as well. They might even be trying to separate out the copper sulfides, which they don't want, which they can't process because they're too difficult to smelt, from the oxidized minerals, which are very easy to smelt. So I think it was, in a sense, a simple technology, but quite sophisticated. But having said that, these launders, these are the earliest examples ever found of this sort of mining equipment. And, you know, they date from it dates from the very end of this launder, the Alder launder dates from the end of the 3rd millennium, beginning of the 2nd millennium BC. So which ore was being worked? I mean, this is a big question. That it's tempting to think that these are sort of easy things to answer, but in fact they're not, because when the mines were being worked, by the detail of hand working and separation of the minerals was so intensive that effectively the mines are pretty much completely cleaned out of anything that is any use to them. And what you do have, which is very different from post-medieval mines, where you often get examples of the ore, it's very hard to find out exactly what they were taking out. So I did some micro excavations in the areas of the tips where I know they'd been crushing and separating mineral, these sort of working platforms in the tips. And what I found out, this is sort of looking under the microscope here, I found that below 3 mil size, these tiny crushed grains of mineral, there was lots and lots of these grains of iron oxide. And when I sectioned them, I found that inside them, the unoxidized cores of these grains, they included this sulfide, chalcopyrite. So I'm thinking that, the fine material that they're actually leaving behind on the crushing floors consists of this sulfide, finely crushed sulfide, which they probably don't want. This is a guess, and there's no way of proving this. But what's quite interesting is that there are some examples we picked up from the tips of where they have survived, of what I think of the ores. This is a thin section which Alan Williams did for me. It shows it's a grain of malachite, copper carbonate, in the center of which we have cores of cuprite and native copper. You can see this is a very small grain, but this microcosm is still actually quite useful in the absence of having the evidence that this is possibly an example of a grain. This came from a crushed grain on the tips of actually what they were looking for. They were looking for these very, very rich oxidized ores, but they might not have just been copper carbonates. They could have been these copper oxides, and in some cases, some of the mines, native copper as well. This is a section of the vein, if you like. It's a sort of a profile section of, you can imagine you're looking straight up the open cars as we see it once we've excavated it, with the vein in the material, vein in the middle that's been taken out in prehistory. And if you can imagine what was there originally, my interpretation is that when they first found the mine by seeing all the oxidized minerals and the colors on the surface, the copper staining on the surface of the exposed lode with the quartz and iron carbonates amongst it. And originally the veins were chalcopyrite, iron copper sulfide, but they had been oxidized down in the exposure, because you've had millions of years of oxidation of these mineral veins when they've been exposed. And so they include a mixture of chalcopyrite, the iron oxides, and also the copper carbonate. So it's quite a mixture they have to go through. And this is why it's quite a complex process to separate out what they want from what they don't want. But effectively, they work down until the water table, the pre-mining water table. And below the water table, you're straight into solid sulfide ores because they haven't oxidized. And that's the point the prehistoric miners stopped. But that's also the point where the post-medievals miners took up the job by tunneling under the mountain from the side and coming up into the prehistoric working. So I call this the early Bronze Age extraction zone between the oxide gossan and the supergene minerals on the bottom, all of it above the water, the then water table. The question is, was lead also being mined? Now, this may seem, some people you might think it's a daft. We know this is an early Bronze Age mine. The use of lead in the early Bronze Age is very thin on the ground. There are examples from Britain of smelted lead objects, of course, but very little. And we're really talking about before we get the Middle Bronze Age, when we get leaded bronzes. So the gleaner veins have been worked and large lumps removed. This is actually in the mine. So we find actually on the Bronze Age working floors these large lumps of gleaner which have just been left on the rock surface. Much of the lead mineral is intimately mixed with copper, and so maybe the lead needed to be dug out to get to the copper. Following the veins, they need to get rid of the lead mineral, and they just left the lead mineral inside the mine or threw it onto the waste tips. The waste tips are rich in visible lead, but poor in copper. So although there are layers of crushed lead mineral, there's no real evidence that the lead mineral has necessarily been taken out and used. So the jury's out on this, in the matter of whether they could have. It's easy to smelt lead, but why it doesn't seem that much evidence that they were removing much of it, because so much of it was left. So the evidence of abandonment at the site. This occurred between 1600 and 1550 BC. So at this point, the mine was exhausted of workable ore and was flooded. In fact, this flooding started much earlier than this, around about sort of 1800, 1900 BC, when they got to the deepest point in the mine, which is at least 10 meters below ground level. The mine started filling up with water, and they couldn't cope with by bailing it out and putting it, tapping it from the drainage line. It was just filling up with water. And this partly reflects the enroachment of blanket P. It partly reflects climatic change, and it partly reflects the depth of the mine. And what we do see, we know that by the end of the early Bronze Age mining period, they were still mining, but the bottom of the mine was already flooded, because they were throwing down timbers into the mine, and moss and plants, water plants, were forming at the bottom of the mine. So it must have been already flooded at the point they were still working. but by the Middle Bronze Age, you see a complete abandonment, no more human activity, or very little human activity, but massive influx of peat being washed in and also forming, growing inside the now completely flooded mine. In recent years, by spreading out our surveys of the valley, we found miraculously another site. So this is the second Bronze Age mine. It's intervisible with the first. So in the background, we can see the Comet Lode open cast. This is a site at Pen Park, West Camuswith, which has a similar date, although it seems to be slightly later. So it's quite possible that they were expanding, they were prospecting beyond the main mine and looking for other sources of similar ores. In fact, what it appears that the prehistoric miners followed the course of the copper-bearing Comet Lode. You can see the Comet Lode here. It gets a bit complicated because the Comet Lode is faulted by the Ystwyth Fault. So in fact, anybody following the Comet Lode looking for other deposits along this vein would have lost it. But interesting, they picked it up again because they must have realized that, that if they followed it along, they found the same lode again that had been displaced. So clearly they were pretty good at prospecting and working out where things might be, much as modern miners would be. So here the chalcopyrite at the outcrop was altered to an iron gossan, beneath which was almost certainly oxidized copper minerals. And it's interesting because at the Pen Park mine, we found evidence of this iron gossan, whereas on the Comet Lode, most of it has been removed, and so we don't see it. So it's a good example of what they were looking for, and the fact that the vein was completely oxidized out, and the copper must have been converted to oxidized minerals. So these are a range of stone mining tools from the Pen Park mine: pounders, ore crushers, anvils, flake debitage. Very similar, but what we did here is that we did a complete excavation of 1 cubic meter of mine spar and sieved it, and what we realized, it's actually a really useful exercise for anybody excavating these sites to look for the finest splinters of the use of these stone tools, which are all mixed up in the mine waste. I mean, the reason why it's useful is that if you just find the stone tools, if you find all the splinters, if you look for the splinters of their use within the spoil, you can be pretty certain that the source of the mining is very close to where you are. Because sometimes it's not particularly obvious where the extraction site was. You just find evidence of these stone tools in the mine spoil, but you're trying to work out where the extraction was taking place or whether the material has been transported. So this is a very good indication of immediately local, that this material hasn't moved far, it's right on the spot where it was used. So we have also some very good environmental evidence for seasonal working at the mines, for clearance and also for grazing. From the Comet Lode open cast, there's quite some amazing examples. You see these summer-autumn colors present in a leaf peat sealing the working layers. You see bracken fronds within the mine sediments and whole layers of freshly cut hazel brush laid upon the working surfaces in the mine. So this is giving us an indication. We're talking about late summer, early autumn working. We also find evidence of broken hazelnut shells within the mine floors, working areas. Lots of plant evidence for seasonal flooding. So this idea of seasonality is creeping into the narrative. We're looking at in the mine infill deposits and on the working floors of the mine, environmental evidence. We're looking at evidence for grazing, good grazing indicators like fungal spores, pollen, and beetles. And this is a pollen record of the non-arboreal and arboreal pollen record taken from the Blanket Peak near the mine. And although it's very difficult to interpret for you to see the detail here, but what is shown, this is the mining period, the radiocarbon dated. We have a radiocarbon dated monolith here. This is the mining period indicated by the 2 red lines. And we see very, rather than massive evidence for arboreal pollen, tree pollen decline. We say very small scale incremental increases and decreases, increases and decreases. So clearly they weren't, there was no evidence of deforestation. They're sort of managing the environment. They're just using, new woodland from around, possibly even coppicing, but clearly there's no big tree declines. And this supports the idea that this is seasonal working over a long period of time rather than a really intensive period of working. So talking, following on for this idea of seasonality, the idea of tree clearance associated with mining. When we look at the map of the Central Wales ore field, and here we have all these early Bronze Age mining and prospection sites indicated in these green circles here. What they do, they're bunching up into groups. And it sort of occurred to me, the more I looked at this and thought about it, I could see that these groups were associated with these east-west valleys coming from the coast, and also from the other side of the watershed of the Cambrian Mountains, the east-west valleys like the Severn and the Wye, coming from the border areas. And they're associated in these groups. And so, my interpretation here is that what we're looking at is probably clearances for pastoralism, clearances of the uplands. And in these areas of clearances, what's happening is we get erosion, loss of soil, exposure of the mineral veins, and with people, having these clearances and keeping pasturage in these areas, these pasturage areas effectively become the prospection areas. And we know that a lot of it's basically segmented clearances rather than wholesale clearances of the mountains. Another interesting thing is that the stones I refer to that come from the coast only come on the west side of the watershed up these east-west valleys from the coast of Cardigan Bay. Whereas on the other side of the watershed, we don't get any beach pebbles or coastal cobbles, and they're all use of river cobbles or glacial erratic cobbles, which are inferior. But this watershed is a real divide between the mines on the west and the mines on the east. This is an example, one of the mines on the east of Plinlimmon at Nanterera, which we worked at in 1988 and again in 2014. Really very ice. This is at 500 meters above sea level. Extremely isolated mine, even for the modern period. But there was a large Bronze Age, early Bronze Age mining campaign going on, mining on the copper veins here. So, what of the archaeological context of these sites? Well, by serendipity, one of the most famous recent finds, gold finds from Wales, turned up right on our doorstep. This was this gold foil disc, which was found at Bankton Dole, which is at the foot of the mineral vein on Copper Hill. It couldn't be closer, 300 or 400 meters from the mine on the Comet Lode open cast at the base of the hill. In what appears to be a grave cut, we found this Beaker gold foil ornament, which had been placed within the grave. There was no survival of skeletal remains, but it seems likely that it was an inhumation. Very acidic soils. And this was the only find, apart from some traces of bone, which we were unable to date, unable to use for DNA or anything. But it appears that it is human bone, but just fragmentary. But I think this is this is a very good example of one of these Atlantic type gold foil disc Beaker gold ornaments. The composition of it is from alluvial British gold, could be Welsh or Irish. We don't know whether it's local or was imported from Ireland. 2.5 grams, but it was quite an amazing find. And it really, I think, does link this site with some Beaker presence in this valley. Another, just immediately opposite the mine on this dramatic plateau, and this is intervisible with the mine, was this large curb can circle monument, which we excavated in 2016, and from which we got two nicely refitting halves of Macehead and quite a lot of other finds as well. This Neolithic Bronze Age monument it's very difficult to actually link it to the mine. It could be contemporary or it could be earlier, but at least we now see ourselves sitting in a landscape which has other elements to it. This is a reconstruction of the Pantmorca Can Circle, immediately opposite the mine, Copper Hill. Within the upland mining district, Central Wales, there are a number of clues as to this Beaker presence within the area. I think one of the main ones is the vast numbers, in my opinion anyways, the vast numbers of these Irish affinity, Barmtang flint arrowheads, which have been eroding out from the blanket peat in the Cambrian Mountains within the mining area. There may not, obviously there's no direct connection here, but there's a significant presence, and there's so many have been found now that clearly this appears to be in a hunting territory. So these arrowheads maybe indicate areas of clearance where hunting was going on, also perhaps where red deer were being hunted, because we know that a lot of deer antler has been used in the mines. And also there's evidence within this area for some rare metal finds, for instance, this halberd Irish type A metal, which is from Ross Island, within the Uswith Valley, close to Cwmystwyth. So there's some Beaker burials within the area, not a lot, but this area is quite thin on the ground. Really, is for early Bronze Age archaeology. But what is there, could show some linkage to the presence of these sites, because the mines, and also this routeway through the mountains marked by stone alignments, which goes right through the past 3 or 4 of these early Bronze Age mining sites. I'm not going to say too much about this, but just that the Bankton Dole gold disc is part of an Atlantic tradition. And we see this particular type of Copper Age, early Bronze Age gold disc with this repousse ornament and with this circular motif rather than the cruciform motif that they spreading from Portugal, northwest Iberia, along the Atlantic coast of France into Brittany, into the west of Britain, and to Ireland. And there's, of course, Mary Cahill has been looking at a number of these gold discs from Ireland. So I think this represents part of this Atlantic tradition, which may well be linked to a metal route from northwest Iberia. And I think Billy O'Brien also thinks that perhaps the developer mining in Ireland is linked in some way with this Atlantic this Atlantic route of prospection and connectivity with the continent. Were the first metal miners pastoralists? So these are two models. Here we have a model for prospection. So basically, this is just a graphic show of who was mining at these sites in the mining district of Central Wales. So pastoralists, you know, this more, I believe the pastoralists were probably moving from the coastal winter pastures, moving up into the mountains along river valley ridge routes in the late spring or summer into the areas, the pasturage areas, where there were small scale, incremental small scale woodland clearance, and associated with this erosion, and I said before, exposure of the mineral veins in the heart of these, on the valley sides where the forest is being removed. And as a result of the exposure of mineral prospection, samples and information come back with the pastoralists and is exchanged with metal workers who are coming into the area. That knowledge exchange is then, then initiates new interest in the next seasonal cycle. So, they realize that there's a product there they can extract, and they've got somebody to exchange with. So this is a model for small-scale mining. So once prospection has developed into small-scale mining at the sites, we have the same sort of thing that from the coastal winter pastures, the cattle go inland, and we probably it is more likely to be cattle than sheep in the mountains. Cattle will be carrying supplies of stone tools from the coast. The areas are cleared with seasonally worked mines. There's more clearance of trees for fuel, fuel for fire setting and mining. The minerals is processing of ore at the valley campsites within the mining areas, and the cattle carrying bags of ore back, meeting with metal ores, and they're exchanging. I think the likelihood is they're exchanging ore concentrate for metal objects rather than smelting themselves. And of course, there's analogies today in the mining of methods by pastoralists and nomadic groups, or simply the poor and dispossessed throughout the world. And we're looking, these are all modern pictures here, although they look quite basic and sort of primitive type of working in sort of Mongolia and India for gold and for tin. And these are models considered with respect to traditional territories and the need for nomadic peoples and pastoralists to enter the exchange economy through mineral extraction, and often the easiest sort of mineral extraction on seasonal basis sometimes. Now, finally, I'm going to just finish off my talk today with a brief journey to the southwest of England. So here we're looking at sources of alluvial tin and gold. This is a picture of the Carnan Valley Streamworks, which is the Carnan Valley near Truro in 1900s. The Carnan Valley from the 18th century through to the 1900s was an important extraction site for alluvial tin on an industrial scale. But from the 18th century, they found when they were tinning at depths, going down to the tin ground in the valley, like damming up the river, the Carnan, and excavating down to the fossil placers beneath, they found prehistoric artifacts actually on the tin ground itself. One of these was this tin mining tool. It's an antler pick, which is in the Royal Cornwall Royal Institution of Cornwall, i.e. Truro Museum. It was given to the museum in the 18th century. It was dug up in 1790 from the bed, from the tin ground on Carnan Stream by the miners of William Robert Fox. And it's been sitting in the museum ever since then. And I took it upon myself to get permission to radiocarbon date the antler. And so, well, surprised or not surprised, the date, it turned out a date of towards the end of the early Bronze Age, 1620 to 1463 Cal BC, from a date taken on the collagen of the antler. The antler is a very interesting tool in the sense that rather like I described Ecton, it's been pierced at the crown end, simply because in mining, the tines wear down very quickly. So although the tine would have been originally used as an antler pick end, once it's worn down, they the way to modify this is to insert tines, new tines in replacement tines. So it's got evidence of the tooling marks. Also interesting, that's what appear to be tally marks. So somebody's been cutting the antler, perhaps as a recording of some element, a quantity or number of individuals, or something to do with its use. It's a method of recording numbers. We can't really say much more beyond that, but it was quite an interesting find. So this was, you know, an important element of the new research into the evidence for Bronze Age tinning in Cornwall and Devon. And so this is part of now a much bigger project, which I'll talk about in a moment. We worked out from the documentary records that in 1790, they were probably tinning here near Perranworthal. So this suggested find spot for the antler and possibly prehistoric workings on the tin ground at 40-foot depth is near Perranworthal. This is I'm just showing some of this site, the evidence as it's coming up for other evidence for early Bronze Age extraction of alluvial tin. Andy Jones was involved in writing up this Beaker settlement at Sennin on the Land's End Peninsula, where stone tools possibly used for crushing tin ore were associated with a Beaker settlement. There's cassiterite pebbles from various sites, including quite recently a site at Tregurra near Truro, which the Cornwall Archaeological Unit investigated. And what I want to point out here is that Alan Williams and Ben Roberts at Durham have got a Leverhulme grant, which is a project called Project Tin, to investigate the evidence, a detailed investigation, scientific investigation of the evidence for extraction of tin in the Bronze Age in Cornwall and Devon in southwest England. Finally, alluvial gold. So the Carnan Valley is also associated with alluvial gold, and the 18th and 19th century tinners used to take a goose quill with them, and when they were, it was considered their perk that when they were tinning, they could, if they came across gold, they used to fill the quill with gold. And so there's, you know, it was a byproduct, a perk of tin streaming, was to extract gold in small amounts. Penhallerick considers that more than 1.25 tons of gold might have been recovered from the tin streams of Cornwall between the prehistoric period and the 19th century. The Harlyn Bay gold luna found on the north coast of Cornwall appears to be manufactured from local alluvial gold. And if you go to Truro Museum, there are many examples of some of the gold nuggets which have been recovered from the Carnan and from the Pentuin valleys and from Laddock and places like that. Chris Standish at Bournemouth has been looking at the stable isotope composition of gold artifacts from Ireland and elsewhere, and has shown that it doesn't seem to be Irish gold, but it's quite likely to be from southwest England or possibly from Wales. And so this really raises the interest in this concept of, you know, prehistoric gold, southwest England being an important location for prehistoric gold extraction. Gregor Borg at Halle University has been looking at some of the gold and tin from the Nebra Sky disk, and believes the gold in particular comes from the Carnan Valley. Of course, the Nebra Sky disk was found in East Germany, and the bronze comes from the Mitterberg, the Austrian mines, but Borg believes that the gold and the tin come from southwest England. So finally, there may have been a Beaker connection with metal mining associated with a metal route stretching from Atlantic Europe to Ireland to Britain. The earliest Bronze Age copper miners between 2100 and 1600 BC may have been pastoralists, prospecting for ores and mining in summer autumn months. Stone tools were brought from the coast, whilst wood came from the clearance of new pastures. These peoples may have been nomadic and largely aceramic, and perhaps on the very margins of Bronze Age society elites. Their mining may well have been self-taught and an ancillary to their main lifestyle as pastoralists. Ore concentrate may have been traded for metal. Remember, these are not, it doesn't appear that they are metallurgists. Nothing suggests that. Ore concentrate may have been traded for metal as part of the exchange economy. Smelting could have taken place elsewhere and was probably largely invisible, and was quite likely the role of visiting metal workers. The first phase of mining was uncontrolled and associated with many different sites. The mixing of coppers resulting from this may have produced metal without any sort of unique source, signature, or identity. The abandonment of the mines around 1600 BC was associated with flooding and the depletion of these small sources of easily mineable oxidized ores, and the rise of the larger semi-continuous mining operation on the Great Orme, which of course is the subject of another lecture. Alluvial tin and gold came from southwest England, in particular from the Carnan Valley, with significant amounts from 1600 BC onwards. Gold was sourced right across the UK. Here's just some useful references, but I recommend, if you had to look at one, go online and look at the article I wrote for Materials and Manufacturing Processes. It's easily available online, and it more or less covers the whole subject of this talk. Thank you very much.
The work that you and your group have done over 30 years, sort of drawn together and really transforming our understanding of this key period of transition to these metals in Britain. I'm conscious of time, so what I'm going to suggest is that rather than taking questions in the room now, because a number of us have precious trains today, I suggest that we take questions over a drink outside, if that's acceptable to those present. So if we can thank Simon again for a fantastic lecture and really transforming our understanding, and express our thanks in the normal way. And I'm going to give notice that the next ordinary meeting of the Society will be held next Thursday, the 23rd of March. It's an out of London lecture, and please note that the time for that, and it will be held online only from Exeter, will be 12:30 p.m. The subject of that lecture will be Dr. Duncan Sawyer on DNA and the Anglo-Saxon migrations, community identity and burial practice, AD